The rain tapped against the glass like an unfinished thought. Boston was gray that morning, the kind of gray that didn't just color the sky, but seeped into people's bones. In the ward apartment, all white walls and clean lines, Ethan sat at the dining table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. Clara moved quietly across the kitchen, her robe brushing the floor. The smell of rain clung to her hair. She didn't look at him when she poured herself another cup. That silence between them wasn't new. It was a silence that had grown roots deep, steady, familiar. "Long day ahead?" she asked, her tone almost polite. Ethan nodded. "Client meeting. Maybe late." She hummed. No follow-up, no curiosity, just that. He wanted to ask her about her class, about the new paper she'd been writing. But each time he tried, it felt like opening a wound that no longer healed, so he said nothing. When she finally looked up, her eyes were tired. "You forgot, didn't you?" He blinked. "Forgot what?" Clara gave a small, humorless laugh. 8 years today, Ethan. 8 years of marriage. I bought you a gift last week. It's still in my drawer." The air thickened. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again. "I'm sorry," he managed. Work's always been," she interrupted softly. "That's the problem." She sat down opposite him, wrapping her hands around her mug. Her wedding ring caught the dim morning light, a faint reminder of promises they both stopped believing in. "I used to think we'd build something beautiful together," she said, "but it feels like we built a cage." Ethan didn't know how to answer. He looked at her, the woman he once chased across autumn streets, the woman whose laughter once filled their home like music, and saw a stranger. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, trembling slightly. "Every day with you feels like pure regret." Something inside him went completely still. The words didn't hit like a slap. They sank quiet, heavy, and irreversible. She stood, gathering her things, brushing past him. The scent of her perfume lingered jasmine and something fading. After the door closed, Ethan stayed there for a long time. The rain outside grew louder. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sketchbook, the one he hadn't touched in months. On the first page he wrote, "Regret begins quietly like rain on glass." Then, with mechanical precision, he began to draw. A house by the ocean, its windows reflecting nothing but gray sky. He didn't know why he was drawing it, maybe to remember, maybe to forget. Outside, the city went on horns, footsteps, lives moving past him. Inside, Ethan Ward began designing the shape of his disappearance. The morning light in Boston had a pale, wintry sharpness, the kind that made everything look too clean, too exposed. Inside their apartment on the 12th floor, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, touching the polished marble floors, the silver-framed photographs, the neat stack of unopened mail on the counter. Everything looked perfect, except for the people living inside it. Ethan Ward sat at the dining table, a newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched breakfast. He was dressed for work, already dark gray suit, crisp white shirt, tie knotted with the precision of habit. Across from him, Clara stirred her coffee without drinking it, her mind elsewhere. The spoon clinked against the porcelain cup in a slow, rhythmic sound that filled the silence between them. Once, mornings like this had been their favorite. He used to watch her in the kitchen, hair messy from sleep, smiling at him over a half-burnt piece of toast. She used to laugh at the way he organized everything, even the sugar spoons. But that laughter had vanished from their home long ago. Now the air was thick with everything unsaid. "Do you want more coffee?" she asked, her voice thin, almost distant. He shook his head. "No, I'm good." There was nothing wrong with the words, but the way they landed, heavy and dull, made both of them feel worse. Clara glanced at him, her green eyes tired, the faintest trace of dark circles beneath them. She looked beautiful still, the kind of beauty that came from intelligence and restraint, But there was something fractured behind her gaze. He looked down at his watch, pretending not to notice the tension. "I might be late tonight," he said, his tone careful, almost apologetic. "Client meeting." She nodded absently. "Of course. Work." The word carried a sharpness he didn't miss. He exhaled, trying not to let it sting. "Clara, But she was already standing, picking up her cup, rinsing it under the tap. Water splashed, cold and fast. "You don't have to explain, Ethan," she said without turning around. "You never have to. You're good at disappearing behind that excuse." The sound of the faucet filled the room. Ethan stared at her back, the curve of her shoulders beneath the soft blue blouse, her posture rigid, and felt the familiar ache return, the one that had been growing between them for years. He wanted to tell her that he was trying, that he noticed how unhappy she'd become, that every night he stayed late wasn't because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to come home to this silence. But his words, when they came, sounded too careful, too rational. "I just want things to be okay again," he said quietly. Clara turned then, her expression unreadable. "Okay? Ethan, we haven't been okay for a long time." He met her eyes. "We can fix it." Her lips curved in something like a smile, but it wasn't kind. "Fix it? You talk about us like one of your projects. You don't fix people, Ethan. You listen to them. You see them. Do you even remember how to do that?" He felt the blood drain from his face. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the city filtered in through the glass, distant sirens, a bus engine groaning, the pulse of another day beginning without them. Finally, Clara sighed. She leaned against the counter, her hand brushing the edge of her wedding ring as if she had just remembered it was there. "Do you know what today is?" Ethan blinked. "Wednesday?" Her smile broke, then brittle, pained. "Our anniversary, 8 years." He froze. The realization hit too late, and guilt swept through him. "Clara, don't," she said, holding up a hand. "It's fine. I didn't expect you to remember. I stopped expecting things a long time ago." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she caught herself before the emotion could spill out. Ethan stood up slowly, unsure what to do with his hands, his words, his regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have remembered." She looked at him, really looked at the man she had once loved with everything in her, and felt something inside her fracture. "Do you know what it's like," she said softly, "to live next to someone and feel completely alone?" He swallowed hard. "Clara, please." "I used to dream about our life," she went on, her tone growing steadier, quieter, almost mournful. "I thought we'd build something meaningful, a home, a family, maybe even peace. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being here. You were always busy, always thinking, always fixing something else, and I kept waiting for you to notice how far apart we'd grown." He stepped closer, wanting to reach for her, to take her hand, but her eyes warned him not to. Then she said the words that would haunt him long after that day, slowly, carefully, as if they had been rehearsed in her mind for months. "Every day with you feels like pure regret." For a long time, the only sound was the rain beginning to fall outside, tapping against the glass like a metronome for their heartbreak. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He only looked at her, and in that look was the weight of everything he hadn't said, every moment he had let slip away. Clara turned, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "I don't hate you, Ethan. I just can't find myself in this marriage anymore." She walked toward the door, grabbing her coat, her purse, her keys, the small rituals of escape. Before she left, she paused, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't look back. "Take care of yourself," she said, and then she was gone. Ethan stood there, staring at the door long after it closed. The apartment felt too large, too still. On the table, her coffee cup still steamed faintly, abandoned but not yet cold. He sat down again, staring at the cup, at the faint lipstick stain on its rim. It was such a small thing, intimate, ordinary, and yet it broke him more than her words. For the rest of the morning, he didn't move. The city outside continued its rhythm, indifferent and alive. Somewhere far below, people hurried. To work, cabs honked. The world turned. But inside that apartment, time had stopped. Ethan reached for his sketchbook, the one he used to draw for her when they were first married. He opened to a blank page and stared at it until his eyes blurred. Then, with slow precision, he drew the outline of a house with no doors, a house where no one stayed. He didn't know it yet, but in that quiet, grief-filled morning, Ethan Ward had just begun designing the blueprint for his own disappearance. Boston changed with the seasons, but for Ethan Ward, every day felt the same. Morning light filtered through the tall apartment windows, spilling across a half-made bed that hadn't felt warmth in weeks. The faint smell of her perfume still lingered on the pillow beside him, that soft trace of jasmine and something floral, fading a little more each day. He would wake to it, inhale quietly, and for a brief, fragile second, pretend she was still there. But the illusion never lasted. The truth arrived with the morning silence, a silence that had shape, weight, presence. It filled the corners of the apartment like fog, clinging to his clothes, to his thoughts, to every sound he didn't make. He began working longer hours after that day. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. He simply didn't want to go home. His office, with its smell of coffee and paper and metal drafts, felt easier to live in. The walls were sterile, the lights too bright, and yet it was a space where silence didn't accuse him of anything. His colleagues noticed the change. He no longer joined them for lunch or after-hours drinks. He stopped replying to small talk, to invitations. He buried himself in blueprints and deadlines, sketching until his hands ached. Lines, angles, measurements, they obeyed him, unlike people. Buildings didn't talk back. They didn't fall out of love. Sometimes, late at night, he would find himself staring at the corner of his desk where a framed photo used to sit, the one of him and Clara from their honeymoon in Maine. The frame was gone now, tucked away somewhere in a drawer, but the outline of dust still marked where it had been. He thought often about her words. Every day with you feels like pure regret. They replayed in his head during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the city outside went still, and the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioner. He tried to drown it out with work, with precision, with silence, but it followed him anyway, like a ghost stitched into his breathing. Sometimes he would take the long way home from the office, walking past the university where she taught. The campus was always alive, students crossing the courtyard, laughter spilling from the cafes nearby, the glow of streetlights warming the brick walls. From across the street, he could see her office window lit late into the night. She was there, always, writing, thinking, living her life without him. He never went in. He never called. But he watched the light in that window until it went dark, until the ache in his chest grew unbearable. Clara, meanwhile, had built a new rhythm for herself, or something that resembled one. She threw herself into her lectures, her students, her research. The university was her refuge, its old architecture and smell of books reminding her of who she had been before Ethan, curious, ambitious, full of words and dreams. Her colleagues admired her composure. She still smiled when she spoke, still carried herself with quiet grace. But those who looked closely could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the hesitation in her laughter. She wasn't fine, but she was functioning, and that was enough. It was during one of those late evenings at the university that she found company she didn't expect: Professor Julian Reed, head of the literature department. Julian was in his early 40s, tall, with dark hair and a disarming calmness. He had the kind of voice that filled a room without raising in volume, the kind of eyes that made people feel seen. They had known each other professionally for years, but lately, their paths crossed more often in faculty meetings, in quiet hallways, in late-night grading sessions when most of the building had gone dark. One evening, as Clara gathered her papers, Julian appeared at her office door. "Still here?" he asked, his tone light but edged with concern. She smiled faintly. "Apparently, I don't know when to stop." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Work has that effect on people who are trying to avoid something." Clara froze for a moment, her hands stilling on the papers. Then she laughed softly, without humor. "You make it sound like a diagnosis." "Not a diagnosis," he said gently. "Just an observation." She hesitated before meeting his eyes. There was warmth in them, but also an awareness, a quiet understanding of pain. She wondered briefly if he had gone through something similar once. They began sharing coffee on those long evenings, talking about literature, about art, about life's odd timing. Julian had an ease about him, the kind that made her forget, for short moments, that she was broken. His humor was soft, his compliments careful, his presence never demanding. And yet something inside her stirred not passion, not even desire, but a tension. The kind she hadn't felt in years. Someone was listening again. One night, as they walked out of the building together, snow began to fall thin, silver flakes catching the light of the street lamps. The campus was quiet, empty except for them. Julian turned to her. "Do you ever miss it?" "Miss what?" she asked. "The version of yourself you used to be before life. Complicated everything." The question hit her harder than she expected. She looked away, watching the snow gather on the steps. "Every day," she said softly. He didn't respond, but the silence between them felt different from the one she knew at home. It wasn't cold or punishing. It was the kind that allowed her to breathe. Back in the apartment, Ethan noticed the changes the later hours, the missed calls, the nights when she didn't come home until after midnight. She always had an excuse ready: grading papers, department meetings, student emergencies, and he never questioned them. He couldn't bring himself to. The few times she was home, their conversations were practical bills, schedules, groceries, nothing personal, nothing raw. He moved around her like a ghost, careful not to disturb her space, her silence. One evening, he came home early and found her asleep on the couch, laptop still open beside her. He stood there for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall. She looked peaceful, softer somehow. A lock of hair had fallen across her cheek. He reached out instinctively, wanting to brush it away, and stopped. His hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly. He let it fall. Instead, he turned off the lamp, covered her with a blanket, and walked into the kitchen. There, under the cold fluorescent light, he poured himself a glass of water and stared at the reflection in the window, his face pale, tired, older than he remembered. Behind him, the silence pressed close again. Ethan had always believed that silence meant peace, but now it was something else entirely, something heavy, alive, suffocating. It wasn't just between them anymore. It was inside him, a constant hum beneath every heartbeat. As snow began to fall outside their window, Ethan realized what scared him most. Not that she might be drifting away, but that maybe, just maybe, she already had. The days began to lose their shape after that winter. They blurred together, the sound of rain against glass, the hum of traffic below, the muted echoes of footsteps that no longer crossed the same rooms. Ethan's apartment had become a museum of quiet absences. Her books still lined the shelves. Her scarf still hung by the door. Yet the air felt empty of her. Everything she had ever touched seemed to exist just to remind him that she wasn't really there anymore. He told himself it was just a rough phase that all marriages went through, distance. But distance, he was starting to realize, had its own gravity. Once it formed, it pulled everything else toward silence. Clara was home less and less. When she was, she existed on another wavelength present in body, but her mind far away. Her laughter, when it came, was lighter than before, but not because of him. She hummed sometimes as she cooked, checked her phone often, smiled at messages she didn't explain. Ethan noticed everything, though he pretended not to. He had learned to live in observation. It started with the small things. The way she dressed differently, softer fabrics, brighter colors. The way she lingered in front of the mirror before leaving, her expression somewhere between anticipation and guilt. The way her phone vibrated late, at night, and she would turn it face down on the table before saying she was tired and heading to bed. He never asked. He just watched. One evening, she came home around 10, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair slightly damp from snow. "Sorry I'm late," she said, kicking off her boots. "We had a small faculty gathering after the lecture." He nodded, keeping his eyes on the laptop screen in front of him. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said quickly, too quickly. Then she disappeared into the bathroom, her voice muffled through the closed door as she spoke softly, too softly into her phone. He didn't catch the words, only the tone. Warm, intimate, alive. A tone she hadn't used with him in years. He sat there in the living room, staring at the open document on his screen, a draft proposal for a client he'd lost interest in days ago. The cursor blinked at the end of a half-written sentence, the little pulse of something unfinished. He wanted to feel anger, jealousy, anything sharp enough to cut through the fog. But what he felt instead was exhaustion, the kind that settled in the bones, heavy and slow. That night, when she finally came to bed, he pretended to be asleep. He heard her sigh quietly as she slipped under the covers, careful not to let her body touch his. The distance between them felt enormous. An ocean stretched across the sheets. In the dark, his mind replayed every small shift, every unspoken moment that had led them here. He realized he couldn't name the exact day their love began to fade. It hadn't shattered. It had eroded. Quietly, patiently, like waves against stone. The next morning, Ethan opened an old leather-bound notebook he hadn't used in years. It had once been a sketchbook, filled with lines and concepts for houses he wanted to build, spaces full of light and air. Now, it became something else. He turned to a blank page and began to write. Not about her directly, but about the feeling of being unseen, about silence, about how love, when neglected, becomes an ache that hums beneath everything else. "When did it start to hurt to come home?" he wrote. "When did love become something to endure instead of something to share?" Each morning before work, he wrote a little more. At first, his words came out stiff, factual, like blueprints of emotion. But as the days passed, they softened. He wrote about their early years, the way she used to laugh when they got lost on road trips, how she'd curl against him during thunderstorms. He wrote about her voice reading poetry in bed, her fingers brushing against his wrist as if she could anchor him with touch alone. And then he wrote about the silence, the way her eyes stopped meeting his, the way she had begun to look at her phone more than at him. He didn't accuse her on the page. He didn't even use her name. He just tried to understand the way architects understand collapse by studying the cracks. In the evenings, she came home later and later. Once he stayed up waiting, sketchbook open beside him. When the door finally opened after midnight, he watched her step inside, startled to see him awake. "Hey," she said softly, removing her coat. "You should be asleep." "I couldn't," he replied, his voice even. "Did the meeting go late?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering. "Yes, Julian and I stayed behind to finalize the conference proposal." There it was, the name, spoken so casually as if it meant nothing. Julian. He nodded. "You've been spending a lot of time on that project." Clara smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He's just easy to work with." He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him shifted, not in anger, but in understanding. He saw how she glowed slightly when she spoke of the other man, how her voice softened. That kind of affection couldn't be faked. It was the same light she once had for him. He turned away before she could see the recognition in his eyes. "I'm glad," he said quietly. She went to bed soon after, leaving him alone in the soft hum of the apartment. Ethan opened his journal again. The page stared back at him, blank except for a single sentence he had written earlier that morning. "Love becomes punishment when one person keeps showing up alone." He traced the words with his finger, feeling the weight of them. In the following weeks, he said nothing. No confrontation, no pleading, no accusations. He simply continued to observe and to write. He chronicled her absence in quiet metaphors. Her laughter exists in another frequency now. Our home echoes with ghosts that haven't died yet. It became a ritual. Writing before dawn, working until late, eating dinner alone, the notebook filled with fragments, thoughts, sketches, regrets. He began designing houses that no one would live in, structures open to the sky, rooms without doors. Sometimes, when he finished a page, he'd imagine Clara reading it. He wondered if she would recognize herself, if she would feel guilt or nostalgia. But he never showed her the journal. It wasn't for her. It was for him, the only way he could hold the shape of what they'd lost without letting it destroy him. One Sunday morning, she left early, saying she had to meet Julian to review lecture materials. Ethan nodded, pretending to believe her. When the door closed, the silence that followed was almost tender. He sat at the table, the morning light slanting across the pages of his journal, and realized that he no longer expected her to come back in the same way. He didn't know if he still loved her or if he just loved the memory of when love was simple. In his next entry, he wrote, "There was a time when every look, every word, was a beginning. Now everything feels like an ending, stretched over days that still pretend to be ordinary." He closed the notebook and stared out the window at the city below, alive, indifferent, unaware of how quietly a marriage can die. The first real snow of the year arrived in Boston quietly, falling in soft spirals that muted the city's usual clamor. The streets looked gentler beneath the white, as if the noise and chaos of life had been temporarily erased. Inside the Ward apartment, however, there was no peace, only the hum of the radiator and the distant rhythm of the city below. Ethan had come home early that Friday. His firm had just lost a major contract, and he'd sat through another meeting filled with polite blame and the hollow optimism of people pretending everything was fine. He felt drained, hollowed out. The thought of coming home used to feel like a comfort. Now it felt like walking into the aftermath of a storm. He set his briefcase down in the hallway, loosened his tie, and noticed Clara's coat missing from its hook. Her boots weren't by the door. She'd said she had to work late again. Another department meeting, another late night. The same excuse she'd used every week. He didn't question it aloud, but he felt the familiar pulse of unease in his chest. Still, he told himself to let it go. He went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood there staring at the framed photographs on the wall, their wedding in spring sunlight, her hand in his, their faces open and happy, unaware of everything they would one day lose. On the counter sat her laptop, half open. Clara never left it unlocked. For a moment, Ethan thought of walking past it, of not looking, not knowing. But then, almost involuntarily, he reached for it. His hands hesitated in midair. When he touched the trackpad, the screen flickered awake. A message thread appeared, glowing softly in the dim kitchen light. It wasn't his name at the top. It was Julian's. For a second, he couldn't process what he was seeing. His own reflection stared back from the glass of the screen, pale, still, almost unrecognizable. He scrolled slowly, his fingers trembling despite himself. The words were brief, but intimate. Not crude, not overtly romantic, but unmistakably close. Julian, you look tired today. I hope you're resting now. Clara, can't sleep, thinking too much again. Julian, about him? Clara, about everything. Julian, you deserve to be happy, Clara. You've carried enough regret for both of you. The thread went on small confessions, bits of poetry they had sent each other, references to evenings spent working late. He read a line that made his breath catch. Clara, last night felt like breathing again. I didn't realize how much I missed that. The cursor blinked beside her words, indifferent. The refrigerator hummed softly in the silence that followed, and Ethan just stood there, his glass of water still in his hand, untouched. The room seemed to contract around him, the walls, the photographs, the smell of her perfume still faintly in the air. He wanted to look away, to stop reading, but his eyes were fixed to the screen, as if understanding was a punishment he had to finish. He imagined her laughter echoing in some dimly lit cafe or hotel room, her hair falling forward as she leaned toward Julian, not out of passion, but of recognition, the way she used to look at Ethan when they first met. That thought hurt more than anything else. He didn't throw the laptop. He didn't shout or call her. Instead, he sat down at the table, the glow of the screen casting pale light across his face. For a long time, he said nothing. He just breathed shallow, uneven breaths, as if learning how to exist again. When Clara returned home later that night, snow dusted her hair and shoulders. She smiled faintly when she saw him still awake. "You're home early," she said. He looked at her, the words he'd read still burning behind his eyes. "Yeah, long day." She took off her gloves, her movements slow, careful. "Mine too." He almost asked her, Then, where were you really?" But something inside him stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the quiet understanding that the truth, once spoken, would destroy whatever fragile structure they still had left. Instead, he said softly, "You should get some sleep." She nodded, kissed his cheek, a gesture so casual, so practiced, it made his chest ache, and disappeared down the hallway. He sat there long after she was gone, staring at the condensation forming on the window pane. The city lights blurred in the frost, distant and unreal. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. At dawn, he packed a small bag, a few shirts, his sketchbook, his wallet. He stood by the window and watched the city wake up beneath a soft veil of snow. He left a note on the table, but it wasn't an explanation, just a line from his journal. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for love is to let it end quietly." Then he walked out. Over the next week, he dismantled his life with the same precision he had once used to build it. At the firm, he handed in his resignation without offering a reason. His partners were stunned. He listened to their polite confusion. "You're one of our best architects, Ethan. Take some time off. Don't make this rash." But his decision was already made. He felt strangely calm, as if the noise inside him had finally settled. He sold the apartment, the furniture, even his car. Each item he let go of felt like releasing another weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He told no one where he was going. Not his colleagues, not his parents, not even Clara. When the realtor came by to finalize the sale, the apartment looked almost empty. Only his journal remained, resting on the kitchen counter where her laptop had once been. On the final day, before locking the door, he walked through each room one last time. The living room where they used to dance barefoot to old jazz records. The hallway where she once painted the walls yellow because white was too lonely. The bedroom where silence had replaced intimacy. He touched the doorway lightly as if saying goodbye to something invisible. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world was pale and still. Ethan carried his bag to the train station and bought a one-way ticket north, no destination planned. Only the need for distance. As the train pulled away from Boston, the city shrank behind him, the skyline fading into mist and memory. He watched it disappear through the fogged glass, feeling neither relief nor despair, only an odd clarity. In his lap, he opened his journal and wrote, "There's a point when love stops asking to be repaired. It simply asks to be released." The rhythm of the train carried him away from everything he had built: his marriage, his home, his past. He didn't know where he was going or what waited for him next. But for the first time in years, the silence inside him didn't feel like punishment. It felt like beginning. It was early spring when the envelope arrived, thick, cream-colored paper, her name written in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. Clara found it waiting on the small table by her apartment door, slipped through the mail slot without a return address. The sight of it sent a small tremor through her. She hadn't seen or heard from Ethan in almost 6 months. He had vanished the way people in stories do, quietly, completely. She stood there for a long moment, the mail balanced in her hands. Her new apartment was smaller than their old one in Back Bay, a modest space near Cambridge, lined with books and the faint smell of coffee that never quite left the walls. She had painted it a muted blue, trying to find calm in color. But even now, the silence inside it often felt too heavy, too still. When she finally opened the envelope, several folded sheets fell onto the kitchen table. Blueprints. Her breath caught. Ethan's architectural drawings were always distinctive clean lines, thoughtful symmetry, the kind of beauty that came from restraint rather than flourish. But this wasn't like any of his past work. This was deeply personal. At first glance, it was a design for a house, a single-story structure with an open floor plan. Yet, as Clara studied it, something about the layout began to feel achingly familiar. The living room mirrored the proportions of their old apartment, the same corner window where she used to sit with a book on rainy days. The kitchen, with its long counter and hidden alcove, resembled the one where he used to sketch designs while she made tea. But then, there were rooms that didn't exist in their life together, new, haunting spaces that seemed to carry meaning beyond architecture. A narrow hallway labeled the Room of Apologies. A small enclosed garden called the Winter That Never Ended. And at the center of the blueprint, a single chamber without windows or doors, simply named the Regret Room. Clara ran her fingers over the ink, tracing the lines as if they might tell her something he hadn't said aloud. Her throat tightened. There was a note tucked. Between the pages, just a single line in Ethan's handwriting. "Every wall remembers what we said when we thought no one was listening." She sat down slowly, her chest aching. For months, she had told herself she was moving on. Her colleagues at the university believed her laughter when she said things like, "It was for the best," or "We grew apart." Julian had stopped calling once he realized that her silence wasn't a punishment, but a void he could never fill. And though she went about her days teaching, grading papers, smiling through conversations, Part of her remained frozen in that apartment she had abandoned, the one Ethan sold without a word. Now, with the blueprint spread out before her, she felt as if he had built a map of everything they had destroyed. Over the following week, she studied every inch of it. It wasn't just a design, it was a confession in architectural form. Each space seemed to hold a memory or a wound. The room of apologies was narrow, with tall walls and a single skylight, no windows, no exit. The dimensions forced you to stand close to the center, as if trapped with your own reflection. The winter garden was enclosed in glass, filled with bare trees. Notes in the margins described the temperature, always cold enough to keep the branches from budding. In the corner of the last page, she noticed a symbol she hadn't seen before, a small spiral, drawn beside coordinates. When she looked them up, her heart skipped. It was a real location, a stretch of land on the outskirts of Vermont, near a lake where they had once spent a quiet weekend years ago. She remembered that trip vividly. Ethan had said, half jokingly, "If we ever build a house, it should be here where silence feels kind, not cruel." That was before everything fractured. She couldn't explain why, but within days, she found herself driving north, the blueprints carefully folded beside her. The road unwound through mist and pine forests, the landscape widening as the city fell behind. She played no music. The hum of the tires and the faint wind against the glass were enough. When she arrived, the land looked almost untouched, just a clearing by the lake, the earth soft with moss and fallen leaves. But then she saw it. Wooden frames, the beginnings of a foundation. Someone had started building. Her hands trembled as she stepped closer. The skeleton of the house stood half-finished, beams of pale timber rising against the sky. It was his design, the same lines from the blueprints brought to life. For a long time, Clara just stood there, surrounded by the sound of wind in the pines and the faint ripple of the lake. Every breath felt like both memory and punishment. There was a small metal box near the unfinished doorway. Inside, she found a notebook, Ethan's handwriting again, neat and deliberate. The first page read, "I couldn't stay where everything reminded me of what I failed to keep, but I also couldn't destroy it. So I built this instead, not as a home, but as an apology you can walk through." Clara pressed the notebook to her chest, her tears soaking into its edges. She spent the entire afternoon wandering the skeletal structure, moving through spaces that seemed to whisper their past back to her. Here, the outline of the living room where they used to dance barefoot. There, the marks of a window that faced west where the light would fall exactly as it did the day she told him she regretted their life together. As the sun began to sink, she sat on the edge of what would one day be the porch, staring out at the lake. The water shimmered gold, catching the last of the light. In the fading glow, she could almost imagine Ethan there, standing in the shallows, hands in his pockets, that quiet half-smile he wore when words failed him. She whispered into the air, as if the wind might carry it to wherever he'd gone. "I never meant for regret to be the last thing you heard." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of echoes, laughter, arguments, the rhythm of years they had once shared. When she finally rose, the sky was dark, and the house unfinished, beautiful in its brokenness, seemed to breathe around her. She folded the blueprints carefully, her fingers lingering on the ink one last time. Before she left, she wrote a line in Ethan's notebook, beneath his final entry. "Some walls deserve to remember. But I hope someday we both forget how cold regret can be." She placed the notebook back in the box and walked toward her car. The sound of her footsteps on the wooden boards was soft, almost like forgiveness. Behind her, the half-built house stood still against the moonlit lake, not a ruin, not a monument, but something in between. A quiet, enduring memory made of love, sorrow, and the hope that one day the story of them would find peace in the silence they left behind. The ocean had always frightened Clara. Its vastness, its refusal to be contained, reminded her too much of the way time moves, relentless and unbending. Yet now, 6 months after finding the blueprints, she was driving north along the Maine coast, the sea glinting through the pines like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. The road was narrow, the asphalt rough in places. Her old Volvo hummed steadily, the trunk filled with boxes of her research papers, a week's worth of clothes, and Ethan's blueprints folded carefully inside a leather folder on the passenger seat. Each mile felt heavier, weighted by questions she hadn't dared to ask aloud. She had found the address through a trail of small, almost accidental clues, a letterhead from a construction company in Bar Harbor, a payment receipt under Ethan's name, and finally, a local news article about an architect restoring old fishermen's cottages along the coast. His name had appeared in the fine print, E. Ward, consultant. She had read that line over and over, her pulse quickening, until finally she couldn't sit still any longer. Now the road led her through towns that smelled of salt and pine, past weathered cottages painted in faded blues and grays. Lobster traps were stacked by the roadside. Wind chimes clinked on porches. Everything looked both alive and abandoned, a place where people came to start over or to disappear. By late afternoon, she reached a small town called Rock Haven. The ocean opened wide before her, deep blue under a silver sky. She parked near the harbor and stepped out, pulling her coat close as the wind carried the cry of distant gulls. She asked a shopkeeper, an older woman arranging postcards, if she knew of an architect named Ethan Ward. The woman nodded after a pause. "Lives near Tidefall Point," she said. "By the cliffs. You'll see his house before you see him. It's the one that looks like it's still deciding whether to stay or fall apart." Clara smiled faintly at that. It sounded exactly like him. The drive to Tidefall Point was short but winding. Pines closed in on either side of the narrow road until the trees broke open to reveal the ocean, a wide, endless gray stretching into the horizon. And there, perched on a rocky rise above the waves, stood a house. It wasn't large, but it had presence. Its lines were sharp and modern, yet softened by the wind and salt. The walls were unfinished cedar, some panels missing entirely. Glass framed the front, facing the sea. It looked like a thought half-built, or a confession caught mid-sentence. Clara parked on the gravel path, her heart thudding in her chest. The air smelled of seaweed and wet stone. As she approached, she noticed scaffolding along the side of the structure and tools scattered across the deck signs of a life lived in progress. "Ethan?" she called softly, though part of her hoped he wouldn't answer. No response. The wind rushed through the half-open beams, creating a low, haunting hum. She stepped inside cautiously, her boots echoing on the unfinished floorboards. The walls were bare, the rooms open to the ocean light. And yet, even in its incompleteness, she could feel him everywhere in the precision of each line, the deliberate asymmetry, the way the structure embraced the horizon instead of closing it off. It was his style, but different. Stripped down, honest. A sketchbook lay open on a wooden table near the window. She hesitated, then turned a few pages. Each drawing was of the same house this one, but with subtle variations, sometimes with a roof fully formed, sometimes half exposed, sometimes with a door, sometimes without. Beneath one of the sketches, he had written, "Perfection is what ruins us. Maybe this time, I'll stop before I destroy it." Her eyes blurred. She could almost hear his voice low, steady, thoughtful. The voice that used to calm her. The one that once told her they could fix anything if they just kept building. She wandered through the rooms in silence. There was no furniture, only signs of work. A coffee mug, half filled with cold black liquid, a rolled-up tarp, a worn jacket hung on a nail. In the corner, she saw another stack of blueprints, new ones. Not the regret house. Something else. This one was called the Shoreline Project. The notes written on the margins were addressed not to clients but to himself. Walls that breathe, rooms that listen, silence that holds, not hurts. Clara sank onto the floor, her knees giving way beneath her. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways: rage, tears, forgiveness, accusation. But now that she was here, surrounded by the proof of his solitude, she felt only a hollow ache. She realized he had rebuilt his life not by escaping their past, but by living inside its memory. Every unfinished wall, every raw plank of wood, was him trying to understand what went wrong. She walked out to the back deck where the cliffs dropped into the churning sea. The horizon was wide and merciless, the wind sharp against her face. She wrapped her arms around herself, listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves. Behind her, the sound of footsteps made her freeze. "Clara?" She turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, wearing a dark jacket dusted with sawdust, his hair longer than she remembered, his face leaner, older. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind filled the silence between them, and it was almost unbearable. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "I didn't know if I should." He looked down, nodding once. "How did you find me?" "The blueprints," she said. "You sent them. The house in Vermont." His eyes flickered with something surprise, maybe, or shame. "I thought you'd throw them away." "I couldn't," she whispered. "I couldn't throw away something that felt like us." He exhaled slowly and stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "This isn't a house yet," he said, his voice roughened by salt and time. "It's a place I'm still learning how to live with." Clara looked past him to the unfinished beams, the raw wood framing the sky. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Incomplete, but beautiful." He smiled faintly. "Like most things worth keeping." The tide surged below them, the sound deep and endless. They stood there, neither touching nor retreating, suspended in the fragile space between past and present. After a while she said, "Ethan, I'm sorry." He didn't look at her immediately. His gaze stayed on the ocean. "I know," he murmured. "So am I." The light began to fade, turning the sea silver, and the house shadowed. Somewhere, a bell from a distant buoy rang faintly through the mist. They didn't speak again for a long time. There was nothing left to explain, only the quiet acknowledgement that time had not healed everything, but had softened the edges enough for them to stand here without breaking. As the evening deepened, Clara turned to leave. She paused at the threshold, glancing back once more. "Will you finish it?" she asked. He looked up at the half-built frame, the beams glowing faintly in the last light. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe it's not meant to be finished." Clara nodded. "Maybe that's the point." She walked back toward her car, the wind carrying the sound of waves and wood creaking gently in the breeze. The house behind her stood silent, half-built, half-forgiven, watching the sea, waiting for what would come next. And though she didn't know it yet, part of her would never truly leave that coastline, because in that unfinished house by the ocean, she had seen something she had almost forgotten existed between them, something fragile, wordless, and alive. Morning came to Tidefall Point, with the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like the world was holding its breath. The fog rolled in from the ocean, soft and heavy, curling around the unfinished beams of the house. Salt clung to the air. Seagulls cut through the mist, their cries distant, as if unwilling to intrude on what the day would bring. Clara returned to the house just after sunrise. She hadn't slept much. The small inn in Rockhaven where she spent the night smelled faintly of cedar and sea air, but no comfort could settle her restless mind. She woke before dawn, dressed without breakfast, and drove back along the coast, her heart thudding in quiet rhythm to the roar of the waves. When she reached the house, Ethan was already there. He was standing by the open frame of what would one day be the front wall, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the horizon. The light caught in his hair, which had grown longer, brushing the collar of his worn jacket. His stillness unnerved her, not cold, not distant, but almost resolved. She hesitated at the edge of the porch, unsure if she was intruding. He turned before she spoke, as though he had sensed her. "You came back," he said simply. "I wasn't finished," she replied. Her voice was calm, but her fingers twisted the hem of her coat. "I couldn't just leave it there. Leave us there." He nodded slowly, setting the mug on the railing. "Neither could I. That's why I built it." Clara stepped closer, her eyes tracing the exposed beams, the raw wood glistening faintly with dew. "You said yesterday it's not meant to be finished. What did you mean?" He looked at her, and for a moment he seemed to struggle with the words. Then, quietly, he said, "This house wasn't for you to live in, Clara. It was for you to remember." She frowned, not in anger, but confusion. "To remember what?" Ethan's gaze shifted toward the sea. "Everything we lost trying to hold on." He motioned for her to follow him. They walked through the open frame, moving from one space to another, the skeleton of a living room, a kitchen outlined by tools and blue chalk marks. Every step echoed softly beneath their feet. "I started this place a few months after I left Boston," he continued. "At first, I thought I was building a home, something simpler, smaller. But as I worked, I realized I was just tracing us. Every line became a memory, every wall a conversation we never finished." He stopped near the back where the glass panels faced the ocean. It was never about moving on. It was about not wanting to forget what made us, what broke us. Clara stood beside him, the wind pulling her hair across her face. "You think I haven't remembered?" she whispered. "Every day I do. Every word I said that night. Every look you gave me after. The silence. The leaving." He glanced at her then, his eyes steady, but full of something deep and quiet sorrow, perhaps, or understanding. "I know. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Clara. I left because love had turned into something I couldn't recognize anymore. It hurt to stay." Her breath hitched. "And it didn't hurt to go?" "It did," he said softly. "But the difference is, when I left, the pain had purpose. It made me see things clearly. You can't rebuild something that's still burning." They fell silent. The wind filled the space between them, carrying the rhythm of waves against the rocks below. Clara walked to the far wall, running her fingers along the rough wood. It was smooth in places where he had sanded it, unfinished in others, like a heartbeat interrupted. "When I found the blueprints," she said, "I thought it was your way of forgiving me, or maybe your way of asking me to come back." Ethan shook his head. "It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an invitation." She turned sharply, the words cutting through her like cold air. "Then what was it?" He took a slow breath, his voice measured, gentle. "It was a memory given shape. I built this so we'd both know it existed, that what we had wasn't just something we imagined. It was real enough to leave a mark on the world, even if it couldn't last." Clara's eyes stung. "So this house was your way of saying goodbye?" "No," he murmured. "It's my way of saying I understand." For a long moment neither spoke. The ocean's roar filled the quiet, relentless, and steady. She stepped closer, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the tiredness that hadn't been there before.
"You look different," she said softly. "Older." He smiled faintly. "Grief does that." She laughed, but it was a sound caught between sadness and fondness. "So does love." His eyes met hers, and something flickered there, a ghost of what they once were. The familiarity of two people who had seen every version of each other, the bright beginnings, the unraveling, the silence after. "You know," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I used to think regret was the worst thing you could feel. But now, I think it's the thing that keeps us human. It's what's left when love can't save you." Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why I called."
It the regret house. Because regret isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's just what remains when you've done all the loving you can. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and gray. Clara looked out toward the sea. "What happens to it now?" she asked. "The house." He shrugged lightly. "Maybe I'll finish it one day. Or maybe I'll let it stand like this, half built, half remembered. It feels honest." She smiled faintly. "You always preferred honesty over comfort." "And you," he said quietly, "always wanted both." The words weren't cruel, just true. And truth between them, after all these years, felt like a kind of mercy. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then harder, tapping against the raw wood. Clara didn't move. She stood beside him, letting the cold drops soak through her hair, her coat. He reached for the tarp and covered the workbench, his movements careful, practical, so him it made her chest ache. When he turned back, she was still standing there, her face lifted to the rain. "I'm sorry I said every day with you was regret," she said suddenly. Her voice cracked under the weight of it. "It wasn't true. It was anger talking. Fear. I wanted you to feel what I felt, how trapped I was inside something I didn't understand anymore." Ethan's expression softened. "I did feel it," he said quietly. "That's why I left. Because I finally understood what you were trying to say." Tears mingled with the rain on her cheeks. "And now," she asked, "do you still feel it?" He looked around at the half-built walls, the sea beyond, the gray horizon stretching endless before them. "No," he said. "Now I just remember." The rain came harder, blurring the world into silver streaks. They stood there in silence, two figures in the skeleton of a home that had never been theirs, but somehow always would be. When the storm began to fade, Clara turned toward the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe remembering is enough." Ethan didn't stop her. He just nodded once, watching her walk back into the mist. As she disappeared down the path, he stood alone in the quiet, listening to the house creak and breathe around him. The air was filled with salt and memory. For the first time, it didn't hurt. It just was. The rain had stopped sometime in the night. By morning, a soft silver light washed over the coastline, turning the sea into a sheet of glass. The wind had died down, and the world outside was quiet, except for the slow, steady rhythm of the tide creeping toward the rocks below. Clara stood inside the unfinished house, barefoot on the cold wooden floor. The scent of salt and wet pine lingered in the air. Her hair was damp from the night storm, strands clinging to her face as she looked out at the ocean through the frame of what should have been a window. The world beyond was vast, infinite, indifferent. She hadn't slept. After Ethan left her standing in the rain, she had returned to her rented room, but the silence there had been unbearable. Every corner whispered his name. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like his voice. By dawn, she was back at the regret house, unable to stay away from the place that now held all that remained of them. On the workbench near the back wall, she found it a folded envelope, weighed down by a smooth, pale stone. Her name was written on it in Ethan's handwriting, neat, deliberate, a script she'd once known by heart from years of shared grocery lists, birthday cards, and late-night notes left on the kitchen counter. For a long time, she didn't move. Her hands hovered over it as if afraid that touching it might make it vanish. The sea wind slipped through the open frames, brushing her hair across her face. Finally, with trembling fingers, she lifted the stone and unfolded the letter. The paper was creased and slightly damp, the ink smudged in places as though his hand had hesitated. Clara, if you're reading this, it means you came back. Maybe you needed answers, or maybe you just needed to see what I built not for us to live in, but for us to remember. I don't know when the line between love and pain blurred for us. I've thought about it more times than I can count. Nights where I woke up wondering how two people who once shared every dream could end up becoming strangers sitting across the same table, too quiet to ask what went wrong. I used to think forgiveness meant pretending nothing had happened. Now I know it's the opposite. It means remembering everything, every mistake, every silence, every word that cut too deep, and still choosing to let it rest. You were never the villain, Clara. You were someone who tried to love in her own way, even when the world kept changing beneath her feet. I know now that you didn't betray me to hurt me. You just lost yourself, the same way I did. When I built this house, I didn't build it as a monument to what we lost. I built it as proof that love leaves something behind even when it ends. This place is every memory we couldn't hold on to, given walls and form and light. It stands because we once did. If I could go back, I wouldn't change the ending, because the ending made me see the beginning for what it was: honest, raw, beautiful in its imperfection. You once told me you feared being forgotten. You won't be. Not by me. Not by this place. Every sunrise that hits these unfinished beams will remind me that love doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. I hope, wherever you go next, you find peace. And I hope you can forgive me for the quiet way I left. Silence was the only way I knew how to love you then, by giving you the space to find yourself again. Don't cry for what we were, Clara. Cry for the moment you finally see what we meant. That's when you'll understand. Ethan. Her hands trembled as the paper fluttered in the wind. For a moment, the words blurred on the page, and she realized she was crying. Not the desperate, breaking kind of cry she had feared for months, but something quieter, deeper. The kind of tears that came when grief and grace finally met. She sank down onto the floor, her knees against the cold wood. The letter rested in her lap, Ethan's handwriting soft beneath her fingers. The waves outside had grown louder, the tide climbing higher, licking at the rocks below the foundation. She read the letter again, slower this time, her eyes tracing every word like a map back to the man she had loved, not the man she had misunderstood or wounded, but the one who had quietly carried her through the years, loving her even as she drifted away. All this time she thought his leaving was punishment. Now she saw it was mercy. He hadn't vanished to abandon her. He'd vanished to save what was left of them from turning into something cruel. A low hum rose from the sea, steady and relentless. She looked toward the horizon, where the gray sky met the water in a line that seemed to stretch forever. The unfinished walls around her cast long, broken shadows. In the corner stood the table where Ethan had left his tools. She walked toward it, each step echoing softly. On the surface, covered in sawdust, was the blueprint, the same one she had received months ago. She spread it open. Now, for the first time, she noticed something she hadn't before. A note scribbled faintly in the margin. The living room faces east, so it can catch the first light. For her. Her throat tightened. She turned toward the open frame of the eastern wall, where the pale morning sun was just beginning to spill through, bathing the space in gold. She could almost see him standing there, his hands in his pockets, his quiet smile as he watched her pretend to measure something, both of them laughing at nothing. Clara closed her eyes. The wind pressed against her skin, cool and salt-heavy. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe, not in regret, but in remembrance. She thought of all the moments she'd taken for granted the sound of his voice when he said her name, the way he'd pause before answering her when he was deep in thought, the way he'd look at her like she was the only calm thing in a world too loud. She had missed him, yes, but more than that, she had missed seeing him, truly seeing him, without the fog of her own fears. And now, through his words, she finally did. Outside, the tide reached the base of the cliffs. The sound of the waves filled the air, not angry, but patient, rhythmic. The ocean would take what it wanted, but not yet. For now, it only watched, as if listening. Clara stood there, the letter pressed to her chest, the morning sun catching in her tears. She didn't cry for the man she lost. She cried for the woman who had never truly understood the kind of love she'd been given until it was gone. The house creaked softly, settling under the weight of the rising wind. She whispered into the still air, her voice trembling but steady. "Thank you, Ethan." Then she placed the letter back on the table, weighted it again with the same pale stone, and turned toward the door. The ocean roared outside, endless and alive, echoing the rhythm of a love that had changed shape but never truly died. And as she walked away from the regret house, the sunlight followed her, spilling through the unfinished wall.